Joining me now in the Cipher Brief studio is Michael O'Hanlon. Michael is, of course, with the Brookings Institution, where he holds a number of titles, including Director of Research for Foreign Policy. Michael, I've had the privilege of traveling to many places in the world with you in the past, and you are currently in South Korea, where you've been speaking at a conference there. I'm really curious to get your take on what's top of mind right now for the folks in South Korea, and thanks for being here.
Thanks, Suzanne. Well, yeah, it was an interesting conference with a lot of participants. I think close to 70 countries, including a lot of NATO member states, but also a lot of East Asian countries. China was represented, but at a fairly low level. Vietnam was here, the Philippines, a lot of South Asian countries, really a remarkably broad group. And it came, of course, the week after that semi-infamous meeting in China with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, where, of course, India showed up, much to our regret in some ways, since China was the host and Putin was the featured guest in many ways. Anyhow, there was a lot of talk in reaction to that. But I think the overall tone, if I had to summarize a couple of big themes, one, the Koreans were certainly interested in promoting their ties to the United States. And there was no particular criticism, by the way, of the Trump administration. Second, they were interested as hosts of the conference, but also in the individual participants and their comments. They were interested in promoting technology, South Korean technology, cooperation with the United States and with NATO. That's why there were a lot of countries here from Europe, as I mentioned, and also Australia. And so there was this emphasis on technology, a lot of talk about, artificial intelligence, robotics, et cetera, the kind of thing that you and I studied together in Ukraine, visiting the battlefields and the arms manufacturers there. And South Korea certainly thinks it can play in that game, which is probably true, given its excellence in hardware and software and so much manufacturing. And I would say maybe a third theme was a consistent critique of China and its behavior, but of course not equally from every country. Vietnam was sort of like the peacemaker in the conference, trying to get along with everybody. And they had a couple of participants on panels. I think the first time in my life I was ever on a panel with a Vietnamese general. And also Cambodia, countries that don't really want to pick a fight with China and yet don't want to pick a fight with the United States or Japan or Korea. And so that was one more notable theme. But this conference is, I'd say, sort of a medium scale conference in terms of the level of seniority. There are some ministers of defense who come, but it's not like the Shangri-La conference where everybody wants to be here. So you have a lot of either ministers of defense of smaller countries or deputy ministers of defense, if you will. General Brunson was here from U.S. Forces Korea, and I think he gave some remarks at the opening dinner when I was still flying in. But the U.S. role was relatively muted. It was more a celebration of the region, and I would say medium and middle-sized powers were the ones that were most frequently featured. I was on a panel, and so was another American, maybe two other Americans over the course of the day and a half. But I would say what stood out more was the number of Europeans on panels, the Minister of Defense for the Philippines, and again, the Vietnamese participation.
Yeah, it's really interesting, Michael, just to get a sense of like some of the conversations that are happening around the world in forums like the one that you're at now. And I just wanted to ask you too, you had mentioned in an earlier conversation that there were also some concerns about strengthening supply chains, which is a really common theme when we're talking about national and global security. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, well, this is where South Korea, being the host, had a particular interest and angle on this because, of course, South Korea doesn't quite have the luxury the United States does of aspiring to autonomy in its supply chains. It's integral to the world economy, and yet it needs to be careful about dependencies on China for intermediate goods and raw materials. And of course, it depends on the sea lanes for energy, as well as for many raw materials and, again, components. So there was quite a bit of talk about South Korea's collaboration with Europe in trying to diversify away from China and even the United States, not so much in reaction to President Trump and his tariffs, but more just as a general matter of sort of good policy making and prudence in this era of supply chain vulnerabilities. So I'm not sure I heard a lot of specific proposals that I hadn't heard before, but hearing them from the South Korean vantage point was a bit of a nuance and underscored just how much the United States benefits from having all these allies, but we have to bear in mind our allies have vulnerabilities to China as well, and those could affect allied behavior in a crisis.
Yep, absolutely. And just, I think you mentioned the Shanghai summit and the role of India there. I think it's opening up a lot of eyes to how important these relationships are around the world. Michael O'Hanlon joining us. Michael, of course, is the Director of Research on Foreign Policy at the Brookings Institution, joining us here in the Cipher Brief studio from Seoul, South Korea. Thanks so much for your time, Michael.
Pleasure, Suzanne. Best to you.